Hello again. So today we're going to address another concept related to COVID-19 and the pandemic. And today we want to answer the question, what the heck does vaccine efficacy actually mean? Now, to explain this, we're going to go into a little bit of math, but again, I'll keep it pretty simple. Now, you may have seen the word efficacy or effectiveness used. This is mainly how it's described from doing an experiment, and this is from looking at real world data. So for the best concept today, we're going to really be thinking about effectiveness. So in order to understand this more simply, we want to think about a worst case scenario. Now, a lot of times it's not a worst case scenario, and that is how an epidemiologist may describe it, but it can be a little confusing. So for simplicity, we'll talk about a worst case scenario where we have patient 0 here, Jack. He's really sick, really contagious, and he's coughing. Now, in this worst case scenario, let's say that Jack interacts with 100 people and none of them are vaccinated and none of them have been exposed to coronavirus before or infected. So we have this 100 people. We keep the numbers simple. So what that means in this worst case scenario is that all 100% of this 100 would get infected. Now, what we also want to consider is in that same scenario, what if all of these people are fully vaccinated with, say, the Pfizer vaccine? Now, we want to think about that and how that affects these numbers. We may be able to answer the question, well, how many people would get infected? Now, if we look back to when the Pfizer vaccine was first authorized, their calculations were that it was roughly 95% effective against infection. And so it's critical that we point out here that this is against infection, and I'll explain more later. So we can use these numbers to do a pretty simple math to figure out how many people in that scenario would get sick. So what you would do is we'll take this number 100, the number of exposed, and we want to multiply it by 1 minus E for effectiveness. And so that math is going to be 100 times 1 minus 0.95, which is the same as 95%, or 100 times 0.05. And if we multiply that out, that means that we have 5. So out of that 100, 5 people who are still fully vaccinated would still get infected. Now, 100 is a pretty big number. So to put this in numbers that are more closer to what an everyday person might be familiar with, everyone probably knows or interacts with about at least 20 people, being your family and friends, maybe cousins, and say that you know 20 people who say that they have been fully vaccinated. So if those 20 people all interacted with Jack, and instead of looking at 100 people, you would say 20, then that number would be, instead of 5 out of 100, you would have 1 out of 20 people who would still get infected. So that means that when you've heard stories before where someone says, well, I'm not sure about getting vaccinated. I know somebody who was vaccinated and they still got sick. That's actually normal because vaccines are typically not 100% effective. Even a really good vaccine isn't perfect, so someone can still get infected. Now, there are a couple of other things that are concerning over time, which got a little bit scary, and that is that as new coronavirus variants were discovered, we found that the effectiveness of the vaccines weren't quite as good. So over time, if we looked at, say, the Delta variant, and this is a rough estimate from the best amount of information you can find, and there's not a whole lot of definitive studies, but this may have reduced to around 85%. And then maybe for Omicron, that reduced to closer to 50%. Now, these aren't exact numbers, but this is an estimate that's similar to what you can find by doing a little bit of research. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is while this may be scary, you also should consider that it's not just about infection. There are other outcomes that are equally important, one being severe disease or severe case. And severe case would mean that you're so sick you had to go to the hospital. And there's also death. Now, what's important is that even the original version vaccine, it was, even if you look at its efficacy against the original discovered coronavirus, it was much more effective against severe case and death. And so for the severe case, it was about 97% effective. And then against death, it was more than 99% effective. I don't remember the exact fraction, but it was greater than 99. So what that means is that if you look at this 100 people that we just talked about, if it was 97% effective against severe case, then worst case scenario, only about 3 people would have been sick enough to go to the hospital, and then 1 or less, maybe no one, would have actually died. So that means that if you think about some of the other benefits of the vaccines, they're actually much stronger than you may consider, because it's not just about infection. And even with those bad case scenarios, when the efficacy is dropped with some of the variants, and we'll say this is Omicron here, the other benefit is that even against Omicron, the vaccine is still much more effective against severe cases. So even if it was about 50% against infection, it's still about 75% effective against a severe case. Now, if you looked at the math that we did here, the same math, that means under that worst case scenario, about 50 people of that 100 may get infected under a worst case, but then only 25 would get sick enough to go to a hospital, would get a severe case. Now, if you think about that, the reason why this happens is that, as we discussed in a couple of previous presentations, when your body is exposed to coronavirus, or if you've been vaccinated, your body will build up defenses, including antibodies and also immune cells. And so over time, your antibody levels can drop a little bit, and so that makes it harder for your body to fight off an exposure and infection. But you still have these memory cells or immune cells that can rebuild your defenses. So while you may get infected and get a little bit sick, you're still better protected against a severe case. And that's it for today.